Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you so much for attending this year's Holocaust Memorial Day commemorative event. I'd like to introduce to you our acting leader of the council, Councillor Regan Abel. Thank you.
Good evening and welcome to Enfield's annual ceremony for Holocaust Memorial Day, and thank you for coming today. As we gather at the Dugdale Centre, we reflect on its importance in providing a platform for civic events that serve to educate, remember and honour. And I extend my sincere gratitude to the representatives of our local schools, Wolfson Hillel Primary School and Chase Community School. Your presence highlights the role of education in passing on the legacy of history, fostering empathy and inspiring the younger generation to champion a world defined by justice and compassion. We are also honoured to welcome members of our local Gypsy, Roma and Traveller communities to our Holocaust Memorial Day event. And I also extend a warm welcome to Rabbi Levy, Rabbi Rich and all of our guests, of whom enrich our commemoration with their presence this evening. Holocaust Memorial Day prompts us to reflect on the profound scars left by genocide in a world marked by unspeakable atrocities. Today, we remember the 6 million Jews murdered by the Nazis and the countless others persecuted under their regime. Our remembrance also extends beyond the Holocaust to encompass victims of subsequent genocides in Cambodia, Rwanda, Bosnia, and Darfur. And this theme for this year's Holocaust Memorial Day is the fragility of freedom, reminding us that the liberties we cherish are not immune to erosion. The atrocities committed during the Holocaust underscore the vulnerability of society when basic human rights and democratic values are neglected. The term fragility of freedom resonates as we reflect on the unchecked rise of prejudice, discrimination, and the erosion of empathy that allowed ordinary individuals to perpetrate heinous acts during that dark chapter in history. And currently, people's freedoms to be who they are without fear are at risk, and prejudice and hate continue to rise across Europe. Holocaust Memorial Day compels us to recognize that safeguarding freedom requires a collective commitment to human dignity, justice, and tolerance. And this is of paramount importance today in 2024, where we have sadly seen and continue to see an increase in hate crimes, anti-Semitism, and Islamophobia. Holocaust Memorial Day underscores the imperative to remain vigilant against forces that seek to undermine these principles, ensuring that the lessons learned from the Holocaust serve as a stark reminder of the fragility of freedom and the enduring responsibility to protect it. However, amid the darkness, ordinary people emerged as rescuers, individuals who chose compassion over complicity. In the face of hatred, it remains our choice as ordinary people to stand vigilant, support the vulnerable, and oppose those who seek to divide us. And we can create a world without fear and bring some light to the darkness in the world. And today, we will share stories of ordinary people doing extraordinary things to make the world a better place. The involvement of young people in today's event encapsulates the hope we hold for the future. And in your presence this evening, I'm honoured with people who understand the importance of remembrance, who stand with Jewish communities and all persecuted communities. And we say, hope may yet endure. And as we remember those who experienced the Holocaust, we must pledge never to forget. Our duty is to honour the survivors and victims, to ensure their stories endure and resonate with each passing year. I'd like to thank you once again for being here this evening, and it's my honour at this time to invite Councillor Alessandro Giorgio to share a few words with us. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Councillor Erbil, for those moving words. And of course, as Councillor Erbil has rightly identified, thanking Rabbis Levi, Rich and Schindler for joining us this evening. Madam Mayor, councillors, distinguished guests, and of course pupils from Chase Community School, St Anne's and Wolfson Hillel. The fragility of freedom is one of the most thought-provoking themes I've encountered during Holocaust Memorial Day, and yet both one of the most and least obvious. Most of us here have won the lottery in life by being born in the United Kingdom. We have freedom on this beautiful island of ours, freedom which is sadly taken for granted by so many. We have free speech and the right to use high praise and offend. We are free to love and marry people of both the same and opposite sex. We are free to vote for our politicians and lawmakers that determine policy which impacts all of us. We are also free to pray for whichever God we choose, or not to worship God at all. In particular, despite what the vile anti-Semites on our streets and tucked behind their keyboards shout and type, in this country you are free to be Jewish. We are free, but anyone who has studied the history of the Holocaust and all genocides will know that we must thank God every day for this fragile gift of freedom that we have. Why fragile? Because the Holocaust did not begin in the death camps. It began with the steady erosion of freedom for Jews. It started with a boycott. A boycott turned into restrictions on employment. Restrictions on employment turned into restrictions on healthcare and education. This then turned into restrictions on what their own names could be. Soon came Kristallnacht, the yellow stars, the beatings, violence, imprisonment, and finally, the death camps. It started with a boycott and ended in 6 million lives taken away in the most horrific way possible, starting with some freedom removed and ending with death. After surviving ghettos, concentration camps, and a death march, Holocaust survivor Alec Ward came to England and he said, "We lived in Southampton for a while, where I was intoxicated with the freedom of England. I could walk freely wherever I wanted. I could ride a bicycle, and everyone was so extremely kind and helpful to me. We are the luckiest people in the world to be here today at this time. Freedom needs to be cherished and not taken for granted, and one way we do this is by marking Holocaust Memorial Day." It was the Nobel Prize winner and Holocaust survivor Elie Wiesel who said, "For the survivor who chooses to testify, it is clear his duty is to bear witness for the dead and for the living. He has no right to deprive future generations of a past that belongs to our collective memory. To forget would be not only dangerous but offensive. To forget the dead would be akin to killing them a second time. There will come a day when those who lost their freedom during the Holocaust but still survived will no longer be able to tell their story. When that day comes, we must continue their legacy of education of future generations. May the memory of the 6 million Jews lost in the Holocaust be a blessing." And it's my honor to invite Councillor Rabbi Emmanuel Levy of Palmer's Green and Southgate Synagogue.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. At the outset, I'd like to express our thanks to Enfield Council for arranging this very special Holocaust Memorial Day event. Freedom is so hard to win, so easy to lose, so fragile, and the gradual loss of freedom can lead to terrible consequences. But there's always a set of circumstances which build the climate in which the loss of freedom can take place. In the years following the First World War, economic difficulties grew in Germany, culminating in the early 1930s in mass unemployment. Many focused their attention on the Jews, who became a symbol of the forces they sought to overthrow. In every century, the young Jewish world looked with suspicion on this people set apart. The Jew was different in his looks, different in his celebration of his holy days. As far back as the Middle Ages, the Jews had been blamed for the misfortunes of the world. If there was a plague, it was the Jews who had poisoned the wells. Nowhere was discontent more obvious than in Germany, where extremists sought to overthrow democracy and destroy the old regime. Why we are against the Jews. That was the title one lecturer gave to his lecture in 1920. His name, Adolf Hitler. From 1933, Hitler and his followers lost no time in carrying out their anti-Semitic program. Starting in April, anyone with Jewish parents or even a single Jewish grandparent was defined as a non-Aryan. German doctors, dentists, lawyers, architects, professors, actors and musicians who happened to be Jews could no longer work with their fellow Aryans. Special notice is declared. Anyone who buys from a Jew is a traitor to his people. Yet those same Jews had fought bravely in the First World War in the ranks of the German army. They'd been a part of German life for more than 1,000 years. And they had contributed immensely to the development of German science, German technology, above all, German medicine. In April 1933, the Nazi boycott of Jewish businesses began. In the same month, Jews were banned from government employment. On the 25th of April, a law preventing so-called overcrowding in German schools was passed, prohibiting Jewish enrollment in German public schools. In May, books deemed as un-German, including all books by Jewish authors and writers, were banned and burnt in great ceremonial bonfires. In September, German Jews and Germans with any Jewish ancestry dating back to 1800 were banned from farming, and their land was confiscated and redistributed to ethnic Germans. In May 1934, Jews lost access to statutory health insurance, and in May of the next year, they were banned from marrying non-Aryans. In October 1936, a 25% tax was imposed on all Jewish assets. And from October 1938, Jews were obliged to have the red letter J stamped in their passports. On the 9th of November 1938, Kristallnacht took place in Germany, during which hundreds of synagogues were desecrated and set on fire. On 12th of November came the decree on the elimination of the Jews from economic life, and Jews were fined $400 million to repair damage from Kristallnacht, which the Germans themselves had caused. And on the 30th of January 1939, Hitler declared that the outbreak of World War II would result in the extermination of the Jewish race in Europe. The rest we know. We see that day by day, the freedom of the Jewish people was gradually restricted like the turning of a great screw. Pierre-Henri Taguen, a French resistance fighter and founding father of the European Court of Human Justice, once said, he said, "Democracies do not become Nazi countries in one day. Evil progresses cunningly. One by one, freedom is suppressed." You may have heard of Primo Levi, an Italian Jew, who described his first day as a prisoner in Auschwitz in these words. He said, "In a moment, the reality was revealed to us. We had reached the extreme. It's not possible to sink lower than this, nor could it be conceivably be so. Nothing belongs to us anymore. They've taken away our clothes, our shoes, even our hair. If we speak, they would not listen to us. And if they listen, they will not understand. They will even take away our name. By the grace of the Almighty, he survived." He used to recall that one day all he had to eat was a raw onion, and he managed to survive. As the bells of liberty rang out over liberated Europe, trials began. When the atrocities of the Holocaust became known, the world was so shocked by what it saw that it felt compelled to act. Out of the carnage of World War II, there arose a new spirit, the spirit of freedom. The perpetrators of the Holocaust were accused of crimes against humanity. We learn in the Talmud, why was only a single man, Adam, created as the progenitor of the entire human race? It could have been many people, only one man. And the answer is so that no one should say to his fellow, "My father is greater than your father." In other words, everyone originates from the same father, so no one can say, "I am greater than you, I'm going to lord myself over you and prevent your freedom from being fulfilled." And President Ronald Reagan once said, "Freedom is a fragile thing, and it's never more than one generation away from extinction. It is not ours by way of inheritance. It must be fought for and defended constantly by each generation, for it comes only once to a people. And those in world history who have known freedom and then lost it have never known it again." Bearing in mind these words, let us guarantee never again the crematoria, the gas chambers, never again the starvation, the torture, the crushing labor. Sadly, memories are short, and freedom, as we know, still does not reign in every country. Simon Wiesenthal once said about the Holocaust, he said, "Believe me, my friends, it could happen again." So it is up to every one of us to ensure that we will stand up for the freedom of mankind. We now have readings by pupils from Chase Community School and St. Anne's Catholic High School for Girls in Enfield Town. Thank you.
Survivor of the 1994 genocide against the Tutsi in Rwanda. She endured a harrowing 90-day period, hiding from the killers who murdered her mother, 2 young brothers, and dozens of other relatives. These words are extracts of the experience she shared with the Holocaust Memorial Day Trust. "I was barely 12 years old when I survived the 1994 genocide against the Tutsi in Rwanda. But my mother, 2 brothers, and 80 other relatives were murdered. During that traumatic period, spanning over 90 days, I witnessed unimaginable cruelty and violence. People beheaded, others brutally mutilated, and some gunned down. Before the genocide, all was well, and I enjoyed a happy, normal childhood. My parents did not have much, but we never went without food or clothes. As the only girl in my family, my dad treated me like a princess. Growing up in a loving home, I was shielded from tribal tensions that simmered between the Tutsis and the Hutus. However, things changed the day my primary school teacher inquired about my tribal background. He did not hide his contempt for the Tutsis. I faced discrimination and was often called a cockroach, a despised insect in my community. There are times where I struggle to put into words the things I experienced during the genocide, but I vividly remember the evening my childhood turned upside down. On the 6th of April 1994, the plane carrying President Juvenal Habyarimana, a Hutu, was shot down as it prepared to land in the capital, Kigali. The president and everybody on board died. As we watched the news on the TV that evening, my father predicted that horrible things would happen to the Tutsis. Sadly, he was right. Within hours, the killing started, and my father suggested that we go into hiding individually, rather than a group, to reduce the risk of our entire family being targeted all at once. We split up. Little did I know that I would spend 90 days hiding, seeing things that no child should ever have to encounter. I cheated death several times, but there is one incident that continues to haunt me even now. I found myself among a group of Tutsis lined up to be beheaded by the Hutu militia. As the queue got shorter before my eyes, I said my last prayer. However, with just 3 people ahead of me, the killers were suddenly distracted by someone shouting that a bank nearby had been broken into. Instantly, they abandoned the queue of death and ran towards the bank, giving us the opportunity to flee and hide. I am often asked how I felt as I waited my turn to be killed. I was numb. I did not want to die, but at that moment, I was dead inside. Another time, I was hid in a disused toilet within earshot of Hutu killers. The toilet, a simple hole in the ground with no flushing system, was no longer in use because it was overflowing with excrement. You can imagine the stench emanating from the tiny cubicle, but it was the least of my worries. Thankfully, when dusk fell, they moved somewhere else, and I emerged from my hiding place, partially covered in excrement. As I mentioned earlier, my 2 brothers were murdered during this genocide. Emil was 6 years old when a grenade exploded in his face. I held him in my arms as he gasped for air and asked for water to drink. I had no option but to abandon his body and run to save my own life. At just 2 years old, my other brother, along with 50 other children, were discovered by the killers who torched their hiding place. Some emotions are simply beyond the reach of words, and the day I realized that the killing was finally over brought some conflicting feelings of relief and deep sadness. As the Rwanda Patriotic Forces escorted us to a protection centre, I was tearfully relieved, yet overwhelmed by the realisation that I would never lay eyes on my mother and 2 brothers again. My father had survived. I am aware it takes time to heal from such trauma, but I have learned to forgive those who murdered my loved ones. As a genocide survivor, I feel compelled to share what happened, no matter how painful or traumatic. I am thankful to the Holocaust Memorial Day Trust for giving me a platform to educate people about the dangers of prejudice and intolerance.
Esther Bastine was an Auschwitz survivor who shared her experience with the Holocaust Memorial Day Trust. These are some of her words. I was born in Lodz, Poland, in 1928, into a very closely knit and enlightened working-class family. My parents were active members of the Bund, or the Jewish Socialist Organization. Father also very actively involved in the trade union movements and a one-time official. I had 2 older brothers, Perez, 15 years old, and David, 18 years old, at the outbreak of war. Perez is the only other survivor, apart from myself, of my entire family, immediate and extended. On the 1st of May, 1940, some 180,000 men, women, and children were herded into the barbed wire enclosure, which was the Lodz ghetto. All contact with the outside world ceased for us on that day, and escape was physically impossible. I lived through the Lodz ghetto until its liquidation in August 1944. In the ghetto, political parties functioned, schools reopened for a while, meetings were held, lectures took place on all possible subjects, music recitals were held, choirs formed, theatrical performance given. All the time, deportations were taking place. Many of my friends died or disappeared. Food rations were getting smaller and smaller, and the gnawing pain of constant hunger had a devastating effect on all ghetto dwellers. Mother became very ill in the summer of 1942, and so Perez and I would bring home some of our soup ration for her every evening. I worked in a factory weaving carpets from second-hand clothing. We learned later that the clothes belonged to deportees. 1942 was the darkest period in the Lodz ghetto. Deportations had been taking place since the beginning of the year. Mother was so ill that she had to go into hospital at the beginning of August. I saw her face, full of anguish and sorrow, and yet I could still discern a loving smile in her sad eyes. Then, on the 1st of September 1942, the Germans arrived in the ghetto with trucks and loaded patients from all the hospitals onto them. Mother miraculously escaped, but my brother was taken hostage in her stead. Luckily, he too survived and managed to escape in the most ingenious way. Had he failed, I would be the sole survivor of my entire family. A strict curfew was enforced soon after, for a week or maybe 10 days, during which time the Germans came into the ghetto with trucks and dogs and dragged away 15,000 to 20,000 people, mainly children and the elderly. No child under 10 or person over 65 was seen again in the ghetto streets. Very early one morning, the SS caught up with us. They arrived in trucks in front of our blocks of flats and immediately posted guards in every part of the courtyard. We were quite convinced that the end had come. We lived on the top floor of the building, and there was a big loft, with access through a trapdoor reached by a ladder. We heard the SS go from floor to floor, and screams of people as they were brutally beaten and dragged out of their rooms. They were our neighbors, and we knew them all. Most of them were too ill to leave their beds. After they had searched all the rooms, we heard the SS order a Jewish policeman to climb up the ladder and search the loft. I was pressing closely to my mother, and I remember vividly bidding silently goodbye to my mother, my brother, my young life, and all that was dear to me. The policeman climbed up, looked around, and saw us. But we heard him say, as he climbed down, "No one up there." It was a chance in a million that his word would be taken. But he took that chance, risking his life. The policeman's name was Jakoboschki. It was probably thanks to his display of great courage, not an isolated case, that I am alive today and not fully shattered in my belief in mankind. In March 1994, my brother Perez was deported to a munitions factory in Slekshova. I then became very ill and had to go into hospital, but came out in August 1944 in time to join my mother for what was to be our last journey together. I did not know then that our destination was Auschwitz. We were herded into a closed-in cattle truck, as many as would go into each one. There was barely enough air for us to breathe, with just a glimmer of daylight from a vent at the very top. When the train finally came to a halt, the iron bars were removed and the doors were thrown open. Many of our number were dead on arrival. We were pushed out, women to the left and men to the right, and told to form rows of 5. Looking around, I saw barbed wire in the distance, and creatures with shaven heads behind the fence. I learnt later that the wire was electrified, and then understood why a woman, whom I saw touch it, dropped dead. What followed is the hardest memory to verbalize. For my mother, although only 44 at the time, did not pass selection for life. By some miracle, I found myself selected for a transport to a labor camp situated on the outskirts of Hanover. Conditions were appalling. We were subjected to hard labor, but at least we each had a bunk to sleep on at night and a daily food ration. But in mid-January 1945, our labor camp was disbanded, and we were forced to march to Belsen. We marched to Belsen, quite unaware of the place and what might greet us there. There were 400 of us, and we were herded into different barracks, which were already overcrowded with living and decaying corpses. I see myself, a skinny, bewildered 16-year-old, running from hut to hut, looking, searching, hoping to find a friend, a cousin, or maybe an aunt still among the living. One day, a friend told me to go very early the next day to a certain point where a few women would be chosen to work in the kitchen, peeling potatoes and vegetables. I got very excited at the mere thought of perhaps having a little extra food. Luck was with me. I was chosen. I worked in that kitchen barrack for a few days. When I awoke from a dreadful nightmare, there were friendly, smiling faces around me, telling me it was all over. I was too numb and too confused to make sense of what they were saying. I was liberated on the 15th of April, but I have no memory of it, as I lay unconscious. The first few days after liberation were joyous and yet sad, confusing and bewildering. I did not know how to cope with freedom after years of painful imprisonment. I was taken to Sweden, where I gradually regained some physical strength. Strict rules were in operation, and no visas were issued to anyone without visible means of support. I waited 2 more long and lonely years before I was able to come to England in 1947 on a special permit as a domestic worker, a maid to an elderly couple. I would say that against all the odds, I have succeeded, but not without scars. In memory of my parents, Sarah Rafika and Ephraim Fischel Zibelberg, my brother David, and all members of my family who perished under the Nazis.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. We will be representing Chase Community School. The poem we will be reading is called Peace, Dread. It outlines the fear that total nothingness within a war can have on a person, commanding total empathy from readers around the world.
Miklos Radnoti, the writer of the poem, worked in Yugoslavia in a copper mine to which he and his internees were marched out and murdered sometime between November 6th and 10th. After the war, his body was exhumed and his last poems were found in his Serbian exercise book in his field jacket.
This was one of his poems.
I went out, closed the street door, and the clock struck 10.
On shining wheels, the baker rustled by and hummed.
A plane droned in the sky. The sun shone. It struck 10.
I thought of my dead aunt, and in a flash it seemed all the unliving I had loved were flying overhead.
With hosts of silent dead, the sky was darkened then, and suddenly, across the wall, a shadow fell.
Silence. The morning world stood still. The clock struck 10.
Over the street, peace floated. Cold dread was its spell.
Thank you for listening.
Thank you.
Many thanks to our student representatives from Chase Community School and St Anne's Catholic High School for Girls. I'd just like to quickly introduce our next item on your programme. We're very fortunate that last week we were able to go and film the Year 6 pupils at Wolfson Hillel Jewish Primary School in Southgate, and they prepared a school assembly for us that we filmed, and I'd like to present that to you now. Wolfson Hillel Year 6 pupils, Fragility of Freedom.
Good morning everyone and welcome to our assembly.
Today is an incredibly important day and we are so honoured to be stood here in front of you to mark it together.
Today is a really poignant day for us as a Jewish school and something that as a year group we have chosen to mark in a special way. Every year we commemorate Holocaust Memorial Day. We remember all the different people who suffered during the Holocaust under Nazi persecution simply because they were deemed as different. The Holocaust, a period in history at the time of World War II, when millions of Jewish people were murdered just for being Jews.
Many of us have had family members during World War II and have ever since shared their incredible stories with us.
I'm here today to speak about my great-grandmother, Eva B. Hart. She unfortunately passed away in June 2022. She survived the Holocaust despite being an inmate in 2 concentration camps, Auschwitz and Belsen. Eva was born on the 24th of January 1925 in Sighet, Transylvania, northwest Romania. When she was 8, she lost her mother, Gazela Hershkovitz, and soon after went to live with her aunt, Sari. Despite the anti-Jewish laws in Romania, she had a relatively peaceful life until 1943, when her and her aunt were sent to live in a ghetto. In May 1944, she travelled to her first camp, Auschwitz. She was separated from her aunt, her sister, and her nephew, Robert, who she found out many years later were killed on the day they were taken into Auschwitz. She had one piece of jewellery with her. It was an emerald 4-leaf clover her aunt Sari had bought her for her 16th birthday. My mum and her brother had a replica made from a picture my great-grandmother sketched and gave it to her on her 80th birthday. In Auschwitz, they had a roll call at 5 a.m. The whole camp had to come out of their barracks and stand outside whatever the weather to be counted. If it wasn't right, the sirens were sounded and everyone said good luck on your journey as someone must have escaped. The counting could go on for hours and hours. Every person had a number tattooed onto their arm. Her number was A7784. They marched every day forwards and backwards to build a rest home for Nazi soldiers that were wounded. Eva arrived at Belsen by train on the 1st of January 1945. She had taken her shoes off and suddenly the train stopped. Then the Nazis started shouting, "Raus, raus, get off." She had to walk 7 kilometres barefoot. At Auschwitz she got food. At Belsen there was barely anything to eat. Within a few weeks she caught typhus. Near the end of the war, when it was becoming clear the Nazis were losing the war, a Ukrainian girl said to a soldier, "Today you're asking me to work for you, tomorrow I'll be asking you to work for me." She was liberated by the Brits on the 15th of April 1945. In 1945 she met Sami Bihar from the RAF, her future husband and my great-grandfather I unfortunately never met. She and Sami were married under Jewish law in Bad Harzburg on the 21st of November 1946. During the wedding ceremony, she had a vision and then fainted. The vision was of her as a child in her synagogue, standing next to her mother, but it was still 1946 and she was still in Germany. I was one of her 9 great-grandchildren.
Emmanuel Graham was born on the 13th of September 1869 in Amsterdam, the Netherlands. Shortly after Emmanuel was born, his mother and father emigrated to England, where his 8 brothers and sisters were born. Emmanuel returned to his birthplace of Holland, where he married Clara in 1892. Emmanuel and Clara had 3 daughters, Esther, born in 1893, Elizabeth, born in 1896, and Sarah, born in 1898. Clara sadly passed away at the age of 58 before the war started. Elizabeth married Alexander at the age of 27. They were married for 16 years by the time World War II started. Both of them perished in Auschwitz. Elizabeth died in 1943 and Alexander in 1944. The youngest sister Sarah married Ezekiel when she was 21 and were married for 20 years before the war started. Both of them died at Sobibor death camp in Poland. Sarah's father, Emmanuel, also perished in Sobibor 3 months before Sarah. There is no record of Elizabeth or Sarah having any children, which is strange because they were both married for a long time before the war started. It means that either their children perished in the Holocaust with no records being kept, or they never had any children, and were at least spared from seeing their inevitable fate. Ultimately, Emmanuel's life was very sad. His wife died relatively young, and he, plus 2 of his 3 daughters, all perished in death camps. However, Emmanuel's brother was Solomon, who was my great-great-grandfather. Solomon had a son called Harry, who had a daughter called Valerie, who was my nana on my dad's side.
Hello, my name is Lois, and this story is about my great-grandma Jacqueline, who has recently turned 99 years old, but when the war started she was 15. When she was living in Liverpool, she would have to constantly go into a shelter, because unlike World War I on battlefields, World War II was a lot more bombing the large cities. So her parents decided that for her own safety, she was to be moved to a family in the countryside, a safe place to live at the time. So she went to the train station with her tag around her neck and a small suitcase with a ration book, a change of clothes and a big gas mask, which was also hung around her neck. This was to protect you from the gas if you got attacked by a bomb. When she arrived, she got billeted by a man at the train station, which means she was sent to another household who would take care of her until it was safe to go back home. She was lucky enough to be billeted with a girl she knew. They were sent to live with a family who weren't Jewish. My great-grandma always recalls how she felt on the night they first arrived. She had never been away from her parents, so she was very nervous, but took comfort with her friend. She always remembers the first meal they served her the night she arrived, which was rabbit. After the war ended, she was reunited with her family. Some fought in the war, checking for dangerous explosives, and others took care of their home. That's the story of my great-grandma Jacqueline.
A great-uncle of mine, Morris Melanke, who died in 2001, was a survivor of the Holocaust. He was born in Poland. Morris's family worked as cookie bakers until the war. Everyday life of Morris and his family changed in 1939 with the start of World War II. German soldiers occupied Poland, creating a ghetto where Jewish residents were forced to live. In 1942, his mother, father, his 4 sisters and brother were taken away on trains to Treblinka concentration camp and killed by the Nazis. Morris, then aged 19, escaped this fate and was instead put into forced labour at a glass factory for the German army. After a number of years, Morris was then transported from various concentration camps, including Buchenwald, Schilben, and later Theresienstadt, where he remained until May 9, 1949, when the camp was liberated. That year, up to 1,000 Theresienstadt orphans were offered the chance by a Jewish charity called the Central British Fund to come to the UK. 300 of them were sent to Windermere in the Lake District, including Morris. He began work in England as a baker and later fell in love with a British girl, Lotte.
Even though the Holocaust happened over 75 years ago, there's still people and places around the world that suffer because they're considered to be different.
Every year, a theme links to Holocaust remembrance. It aims to encourage people to consider the impacts of the events of the Holocaust, Nazi persecution and subsequent genocide.
The Holocaust Memorial Day Trust theme for Holocaust Memorial Day 2024 is Fragility of Freedom.
Freedom means different things to different people. However, what is clear is that people who have been persecuted have had their freedom removed. As a year group, we have considered what this means to us.
When I think of freedom, I think about being free to do whatever I want. It makes me sad to think people in the past weren't allowed to be free. In the future, I hope everyone across the globe is free to make their own choices.
Freedom means to not be controlled by someone and to make your own decisions. I will decide to grow as a person and to take all opportunities to learn something new.
What freedom means to me? Freedom is a choice you get to make without anyone else's opinion or direction. I will choose to be better in the future and make smart decisions.
This year, we've been learning all about World War II and how different people have been impacted by it.
We wanted to link our learning to mark today in a special way. As it is customary, we have chosen to light a candle to remember the millions of people who lost their lives during the Holocaust and the courage of those who managed to escape.
As well as this, lighting this candle also reminds us that we must make sure that something like this never happens again, not just to Jewish people, but to anyone.
We have all found this unit extremely interesting and eye-opening, and we want to share some of our learning with you today.
Let's take you back in time to 1939 and the beginning of World War II.
Adolf Hitler was in charge of the Nazi Party, who were elected in power in Germany in 1933.
They held extremely strong beliefs and over the years began to introduce new laws that targeted different groups of people.
Nazi laws prohibited Jewish people from going to school, marrying non-Jews, voting, being at the house at certain times and doing most jobs.
Hitler began to take over neighbouring countries, Austria and Czechoslovakia. The British and French leaders let him get away with this because he promised he would make no more demands.
However, Hitler broke this promise, despite being warned by Britain and France that if he invaded Poland, he would have to fight them too.
Britain were part of the Allies along with other countries such as France, USA, Canada and Australia, who worked together to fight Germany and the other Axis powers, Italy and Japan.
Neville Chamberlain became British Prime Minister in 1937. At this time, Germany were continuing to build up its army, navy and supply of weapons, and began to invade several areas.
All of these things were against the peace treaty terms set out at the end of World War I. Chamberlain felt the best way to avoid another war was to keep the peace and allow Hitler whatever he wanted. In 1938, Chamberlain flew to Germany to meet with Hitler. Both leaders signed a document called the Anglo-German Agreement, which means they would not go to war again.
However, on the 1st of September 1939, Hitler invaded Poland, and Neville Chamberlain therefore announced that Britain had declared war on Germany.
With the war going badly, Chamberlain resigned in 1940 and died not long after.
Winston Churchill became Prime Minister following Chamberlain's resignation. He was a strong leader and gave inspirational speeches to keep the British morale high.
He eventually helped the Allies achieve victory.
The war shook the world for the next 6 years. It officially ended in 1945 with the Axis powers surrendering.
On the 8th of May, the Allies accepted Germany's surrender about a week after Hitler had died. However, it impacted the world for a long time after.
Britain introduced new schemes to help the sufferers in Europe whose countries had been taken over by the Nazis.
One of these schemes was the Kindertransport, which literally translates to children's transport.
This mission took thousands of children to safety. It helped 10,000 children escape Adolf Hitler's reign of terror.
However, not everyone was fortunate enough to get a ticket, and it became very hard to be one of the successful few.
It was an extremely difficult experience for the children, as they were told they would need to leave their family and friends, and that there was a chance they might never see them again.
We are here to tell you about our great-grandfather, Henry Grant.
He was born in Vienna, Austria in 1923.
Henry left on the Kindertransport when he was only 15 years old.
The Kindertransport was a train that children went on to escape World War II. They got sent to the countryside, which was much safer.
Henry got sent to North England on the Kindertransport and went to a farm to live with other refugees from the war.
At the farm, he met a girl called Trudy, who was also from Austria, and they fell in love.
Trudy, who's our great-grandmother, came to England with her mum, and after she fell in love with Henry, they all moved to London.
Henry's original surname was actually Gantz, but he wanted it to sound more English, so he changed the surname to Grant, which is why our surname is Grant.
Our great-grandfather Henry came to England with nothing, just the clothes he was wearing, no possessions.
He created a good and happy life for him and his family, even though he started with nothing, and it is a huge inspiration to us.
There are still lots of stories just like Henry's, and today is commemorating them. We will never forget their courage and bravery.
Thank you for listening to our great-grandfather Henry's story.
Esther Hochman. She's my great-grandma's first cousin and is 91 years old. Edith, now known as Esther, was born in Herne, Germany in 1932. At the age of 7, her parents put her on the Kindertransport because it was unsafe for the Jewish people there since Hitler gained power. Around 1,000 Jewish children, including Esther, were sent to Belgium. Esther remembers this and said, "The train pulled away and my mother ran after it on the platform. I looked around one last time, that was it." A few years later, Esther's parents were sent to Riga, Poland, and sadly got murdered there. It wasn't long until Belgium got taken over like Germany. Esther moved to northern France, and when that also got taken over, she went to South France. When Esther was there, a kind group of nuns hid her till the war was over. When it finished, all Jewish orphans were allowed to go to Israel. Esther was 12 when she arrived. She heard about Queen Esther from the Purim story. She said, "That really impressed me, and I chose that name because I wanted to give up my German name, Edith, after everything that happened there, and to start something new." Esther is still called by her new name now. Because of the war, she was forced to travel to various countries and learnt different languages. She turned this into a positive when she became a tour guide in Israel. Esther has 2 children, 5 grandchildren, and 2 great-grandchildren, and Israel is home to her family.
My great-grandma Esther Kremer was born in the Czech Republic 1927. One night when she was 16, she was working in a bakery when Kristallnacht, the night of broken glass, happened. Nazi stormtroopers broke in and set the bakery alight. No one came to help. The Nazis took her on a train to Poland where there was a gas machine which killed them one by one. She was held there for months. They tried to starve them, and Esther survived by eating bugs. Thankfully, she was rescued after about a month. While they made their escape, a bomb went off and Esther's leg was seriously injured. Fortunately, a doctor was able to help her and she survived. Soon after, she was put on the Kindertransport to Bulgaria and managed to escape the war. She met her future husband, Shai, there, and eventually they settled together in Israel.
This weekend, I was lucky enough to be celebrating my cousin's bar mitzvah. What made it even more special was that my great-grandma Rita was there to celebrate it with us. Rita Abrams, who was born in Vienna, Austria in 1924. After a happy childhood, the Nazi Party came to power. One night she was sitting with her parents and auntie in their apartment, and they could hear rioting outside. In a moment, her entire life would change when a brick shattered their apartment window in what is now referred to as Kristallnacht, the night of broken glass. It was clear to her parents that there was no future for Jews in Nazi-occupied Austria. They had heard about the Kindertransport, which was a means of getting Jewish children to a safer place. She left on the Kindertransport at the age of 14. Her parents told her she would be going for a year and then they would come to join her. Her train had 2 destinations. One was to Holland and the other one was to go to the English Channel. And then the children would be taken by boat to Felixstowe in England. She was on the train that went across the Channel. When she arrived in Felixstowe, she was informed of various cities where Jewish families volunteered to take in children from the Kindertransport. She volunteered to be one of the first children to make sure she had somewhere to stay and was sent to the Abrams family in Liverpool. Somehow, out of the tragedy of the Holocaust, something joyous emerged. My great-grandma fell in love with the eldest son in the Abrams family, Samuel Abrams. They married and had 2 children, my grandmother Jennifer and her younger brother Gregory. I'm now one of the 9 great-grandchildren that would not be here if it wasn't for my great-grandma's bravery. Sadly, she found out her parents died shortly after she left Austria. but it provides her with great happiness that their legacy lives on through me and my cousins.
In English, we are reading Children of Willesden Lane by Mona Golobeck and Lee Cohen. Mona writes about her mother's memoir 70 years after the war.
This book tells the story of Lisa Jura, Mona's mother, and her fight to freedom.
We begin in Vienna, where Lisa, a music prodigy, is on her way to her piano lessons. Along the way, she noticed that the road name has changed, as it was previously named after a Jewish person, and that there is a Nazi guard standing outside her music studio.
During this book, we have learned that Lisa ventured onto the Kindertransport to London, where she begins a new life.
She is first housed in a home for refugee children in London's Willesden Lane. That's only down the road from us.
We have also been introduced to the rest of Lisa's family. I wonder what will happen to them.
I can't wait to hear about the rest of Lisa's journey, about her being saved by coming over on the Kindertransport as we finish the book in the next couple of weeks.
Lisa and her family story is just one of many that tell us about the prejudice Jewish people faced during the Second World War.
Prejudice is the act of treating people badly and judging them based on their race, religion and differences before actually knowing them.
We can all play our part in preventing prejudice happening again. We need to be kind towards everyone, whether we know them or not.
We should always try to stand up for people, share these stories and ideas with others, and ensure something like this never happens again.
This song is called Never Again and was written by Stephen Melzer.
It was a song written to help people remember the Holocaust.
Please consider why the words in the song are extra important today.
Thank you for listening to our assembly. We hope you will take this opportunity to remember the Holocaust.
Everybody, I'd like to introduce Rabbi Meir Schindler, who's from Cockfosters in North Southgate Synagogue. Rabbi Schindler.
Good evening, everyone. Father Mayor, councillors. When I was growing up, the Holocaust was a real, palpable, living reality. My grandfather was a living survivor of Auschwitz. His entire family, parents, grandparents, brothers and sisters had all been murdered at Chelmno, the very first death camp, where people were gassed in caravans. He began creating a new life for himself in the UK, brought over by his nearest living relative, an uncle, who lived in the UK at that time. My grandfather didn't speak about his experiences in those dark years, especially not to the children. And I can tell you, he would have given anything to forget what had happened. In many ways, he was able to achieve great things because he refused to get stuck, rooted to the past. He was able to move forward in his life, always looking forward, never back. And who could blame him? As a young man, he experienced horrors and grief beyond our perception. Beatings, shootings, persecution, family separations, shoveling dead bodies into mass graves. Who in their right mind would want to remember that? In present times, post-Holocaust, we are desperate to cling to memories in a generation where first-hand accounts are waning. And I want to ask a bold question. Why are we so desperate to remember? Surely it's so much easier to forget and to move on. Professor Daniel Kahneman, a famous psychologist and economist, notes that we should always look at experience and memory as two different things. Experience is how we actually relate to an event in real time, whereas memory is how we recall that event once it's over. Memories, however, are not necessarily perfect representations of the experience. On the first nights of Passover, Jews are instructed to recount the story of the Exodus, and quite startlingly, to reenact it. Through this, we preserve and keep alive the memories and the lessons of the Exodus from Egypt over 3,000 years ago. The preservation of the memories of the Holocaust, I would posit, has never been more important than it is today, where our very freedoms are being threatened. I think it's therefore very apt that the theme for Holocaust Memorial Day this year is Fragility of Freedom. Rabbi Lord Sachs, blessed memory, writes something in one of his books that we all know to be true, and yet we often take our eye off the ball. He writes that freedom is not the same as a free society. A freedom which enables us to do what we want, when we want, and how we want, is libertarianism. But that cannot be the basis for a truly free society, because sooner or later, my freedom will conflict with yours. If one person's freedom of speech means that another group of individuals experience fear or intimidation, or feels threatened or unsafe, then the second group will not feel free. One person's freedom can come at the expense of another. In the current climate, there's a huge unease within the Jewish community. When extreme views with declarations of violence, terror, and even genocide are shouted and chanted on the streets of even Britain, unchallenged, our freedom to express ourselves are squeezed and diminished as a result. Only the rule of law creates the possibility of a society in which my freedom respects yours and everybody is treated equally. In a world where the words genocide, Nazi, and terror are beginning to be twisted, misused, and devalued, when our freedoms begin to feel that much more fragile, in this environment, the remembrance of the Holocaust and other genocides is particularly crucial. What we say matters, publicly or privately. What we post on social media matters. It has an effect. There must be an end to hatred, prejudice, incitement, and intimidation in order for our country to feel truly free. I want to finish with a prayer. I pray that on this Holocaust Memorial Day, we can stand together, reach out, and spread a little bit of this light to others around us, so that we can all enjoy a world of peace, where the lamb will feel secure enough to lie down with the wolf, and swords can truly be turned into plowshares. Amen. I'd like to introduce our next speaker, Maria Hamza, representative of the Roma Support Group. During the Holocaust, over 500,000, certainly over 250,000 of the Roma community in Europe were murdered. Maria will speak on the topic of fragility and freedom.
Hello, my name is Maria and I'm here on behalf of Roma Support Group. Now, the RSG is a charity that has dedicated a lot of time in helping the Roma community. And as a child, I was a beneficiary of this charity, and as an adult, I'm really proud to be working with them today. So I would like to begin by introducing my family heritage. My immediate family are Bosnian Roma, and therefore have been consequently targeted in the Bosnian genocide during the Yugoslav wars. Now, the Bosnian genocide happened from 1992 until 1995. And very similar to the Holocaust, many people were targeted because of their religious views and because of their ethnic identity. Now, the exact number of Roma casualties is unknown,
but it is believed that anywhere from 8,000 Roma people were persecuted and killed. Now, when looking into my family history, I discovered that we'd settled in Serbia in the early 20th century after traveling around Yugoslavia for quite some time. Now, this decision to settle in Serbia during this period would have detrimental effects for my family, as they were later persecuted during the Holocaust. And you would think that these two events would be far-fetched and perhaps even coincidental, but when looking at the context and the mistreatment of Roma people in Europe, especially in Eastern Europe, it is critical to understand that these events were not coincidental, but in fact, planned acts of genocide. Now, Professor Gregory Stanton highlights that there are 10 objectives to a genocide. There are 10 things that must happen before a mass killing can be considered a genocide. Number one being classification, and this is the act of alienating or separating between two races, cultures, and nationalities. Number two is symbolization, a visual manifestation of hatred. An example of this would be the yellow bands that Roma people were made to wear during the Holocaust. Number three is discrimination, and this is when a dominant group denies civil rights to the minority group. And again, an example of this would be Roma people being banned from marrying non-Roma people during the Holocaust. Number four is dehumanization, and this is to be treated with very little to no human respects, as well as human dignity. Number five, organization. Regimes of hatred train people to carry out the destruction of an ethnicity or a race. And number six, polarization, and this is the spreading of propaganda. Number seven, preparation. The perpetrators plan the genocide, and they often use euphemisms like the final solution to cloak their intentions, but also spark fear within their victim groups. Number eight is persecution. The victims are identified because of their ethnicity or religion, and death lists are drawn up. Some are sent to ghettos, some are deported, or some are simply left to starve. And after this step is when the genocide begins. Number nine is extermination. The hate group murders their victims in a deliberate or systemic campaign of violence. And number 10 is denial. The perpetrators and sometimes later generations deny the existence of any crime, which is very true about the Roma Holocaust, which is often referred to as the Forgotten Holocaust. Now, these 10 steps were 10 separate opportunities where the mass killing of innocent families could have been prevented. These 10 steps highlight the infringement on the freedom to live. The innocent Roma killed during the Holocaust and the Bosnian genocide had their freedom to life revoked, had their freedom to grow and to develop revoked, to start their own families revoked. These key milestones that every human being has the right to experience have been revoked during these genocides. The Bosnian genocide happening only 50 years after the Holocaust shows that how we treat and how we see Roma people, even to this day, has not developed. We have not developed in empathy, we have not developed in forgiveness, and we certainly haven't developed in acceptance. And the reason why I say this is because in Bosnia, during the Bosnian genocide, many of the perpetrators knew their victims. They knew what they were doing to them. They had known them since children. And they chose to act brutal towards them, to punish them in ways that you would never imagine. And the complete lack of empathy is essential in understanding why events like this continue to happen. And there has been a history in the persecution of Roma people. All the way from the 1400s up until the 1800s, anti-Roma laws were passed in European countries, which persecuted Roma and banned them from settling in any one country, and made being Roma punishable by death, whilst at the same time enslaving us. The dehumanizing of the Romanesque language, which happens to be my mother tongue, a language that has been inspired by cultures all over the world, and viewing the language as something that is low class and treating it as such, has had significant effect on the way Roma people were perceived, as well as the propaganda produced by the Nazis. This also influenced the way Roma people were viewed and consequently treated. Now, during the Holocaust, it is believed that anywhere from 500,000 to 1.5 Roma people were executed. Now, the lack of knowledge on these casualties of Roma people during the Holocaust shows the ongoing mistreatment of the Roma community. The Roma people were taken to German concentration camps and were sterilized. They were treated and punished inhumanely, the freedom of reproduction stolen from them, simply for the crime of being Roma. Now, many of the punishments included sterilization, deportation, or being sent to either a work camp or a death camp. And this just shows the complete lack of regard for the Roma community. Now, my family has been greatly affected by the Holocaust. My great-grandmother had told me the story of her father's passing many times before her own death in 2013. She remembered the event and the mistreatment of her family. She remembered the event and the mistreatment of her family vividly, impacting her for the rest of her life, and consequently her ancestors. In 1939, the beginning of the Second World War, there was a period known as ethnic cleansing, and Serbia was the first country to be ethnically cleansed by the Nazis. There were periods where Nazi soldiers would come during the night and raid the homes of civilians, and many Roma men were killed defending their families. In April 1941, the Nazi raids became frequent, and my grandmother's neighborhood knew that they were coming and anticipated it. And the reason why they knew they were coming is because the Serbian police officers had given up the location of the Roma communities. And this is heartbreaking because there was a relationship between these communities and the government and police officers, and the local people. There was that relationship there. And they'd given them up because they were Roma. Now, my grandmother was too young to understand this betrayal. At the time of this event, she was only 5 years old. In June 1941, her house was raided, and the Nazis gathered all the men, and my grandmother hid under the table and watched as they dragged away her father and her uncle, and they never came back. It was later found out that they were taken to a field a few miles away, and they had to dig their own graves and were told to line up and were shot. And their bodies have never been found, and they've never been laid to rest. And during this event, Roma men were specifically targeted. And this type of injustice has greatly affected the way that I view politics, society, and history. And as a young Roma woman who is studying history, the lack of representation for the injustice that Roma people have endured is harrowing. I hope throughout my career as a historian, I might bring more light to the victims of the forgotten Holocaust. The fragility of freedom has affected the Roma community deeply. The constant fear of persecution highlights how easily our freedom and dignity can be stripped. The camps were liberated in 1945, and many of the horrors of the Holocaust were revealed, and the living victims were free to leave. However, Otto Rosenberg, a Roma survivor and activist, stated, "We are liberated, but never free." The horrors of the Holocaust tormented many of the victims in the following years, the memories engraved in their minds, just highlighting how fragile our freedom can truly become. The effects of the Holocaust echoes generations later. Those who survived were left with severe trauma, severely affecting their relationship with their surviving family, and created a fear around police and government, which is still very much prevalent in the Roma community today. These experiences and traumas have created a rift between generations and have contributed to generational trauma. The inability for the older generation to open up and share their experiences, and therefore being withdrawn, has created exceptional emotional separation within families. Now, having studied Roma history and living as a Roma person today, I have seen in all the ways that Roma people have been persecuted throughout history. As a society, we need to intervene if we spot any form of persecution, especially if you notice any of the 10 steps of genocide, as well as take strides in preventing these perceptions of Roma people continuing in today's society and mainstream media. But I also encourage you to understand just how integral European Roma communities are. Take the time to educate yourself on Roma values and morals, to view Roma people as real people, as mothers, as carers, as citizens, and agents whose voices could considerably contribute to what we know and how we view the world. Thank you. Okay, I would like to introduce Rabbi Danny Rich.
Madam Mayor, Acting Leader of the Council, Leader of the Opposition, Rabbis Levy and Schindler, your moving tribute on behalf of the Roma community, local pupils, friends. It's hard being the last speaker because much has already been said, and it would be easy not to say anything because so much has been said. But I hope you will forgive me if I make a few comments, beginning with reminding us how important it is and thanking Enfield for marking the Holocaust Memorial Day and paying tribute to the Trust, which coordinates the events across the United Kingdom and which has selected as its annual theme this year, as we've already heard, the Fragility of Freedom. If our purpose in gathering this evening is not only to remember the numerous occasions when one group of humans has behaved appallingly to another, but also to seek to prevent future genocides, then we need to first acknowledge that the capacity of one person to seek to dominate another is a prevalent characteristic of many people. This desire may not arise merely from malice. Perhaps it's explained in Jewish thought by the idea that each individual is made up of two inclinations, the Yetzer Tov, the desire to do good, and the Yetzer Hara, the capacity to be selfish. A functioning human being actually needs both, although the moral person needs a great deal of the Yetzer Tov and only a tiny bit of the Yetzer Hara. To paraphrase the Babylonian Talmud, a Jewish text completed some 1,500 years ago, every one of us needs a little ambition, an iota of get up and go, a little self-respect, a tiny dose of Yetzer Hara, of selfishness. But none of this ought to occur at the expense of our neighbour. Thus, the protection of freedom begins with each one of us recognizing that freedom may be about restraining our desires, or at least not prosecuting our interest at the expense of others. The second reality check, as we've heard already, is to remind ourselves that genocide is not an overnight phenomenon, but is rather a slow and subtle process, beginning often with what appear to be minor restrictions on particular freedoms, say of speech or worship, or even a change in language or atmosphere targeted at a minority or an activity. Frequently, this process goes unnoticed by the majority of the population, who go about their daily lives with minimal interference. Some who do notice retreat in the hope that it will not happen to me, or console themselves that oppression only comes to those who deserve it or have provoked it. And as you correctly said, the rabbis reminded us that in the future no person could claim superiority on the basis of ancestry, since all have arisen from the same origin. Well, if we can acknowledge our common origin, then by logical extension, the freedom we desire for ourselves is the same freedom we must confer on others. Freedom is both precious and fragile, and items which are fragile need careful handling, and those which are precious need safeguarding. Holocaust Memorial Day 2024 and its theme of the fragility of freedom remind us that it is by our efforts of collective vigilance that oppression is conquered and freedoms guaranteed. I shall end with the words of an American rabbi, Abraham Joshua Herschel, who observed, "It is dangerous to take human freedom for granted, to regard it as a prerogative rather than obligation, as an ultimate fact rather than an ultimate goal. It is the beginning of wisdom to be amazed at the fact of our being free. It is the beginning of wisdom to be amazed at the fact of our being free, and it is the continuation of wisdom when we work to maintain it." Thank you.
Thank you all, and a massive thank you to all of our speakers, to all of the children, at Wilson Hillel School and St Anne's School and Chase Community School, and to everyone that's attended tonight. I'd just like to close the evening with a quote from Manfred Goldberg, who is a survivor of the Holocaust. "We survivors are sometimes seen as symbols of the renewal of hope and the deep tenacity of life. Today, that renewal is shaken and our hope subdued. And I say, for Manfred and all other survivors, and for future generations today, let's work tirelessly to protect freedom, to protect their memory, to fight for hope, and never forget the atrocities of the past. We must always stand united against hatred and injustice." Thank you once again for joining us this evening.
In class, we have considered how one day we would love to live in a world where everyone is treated as equals, in a world full of positivity and hope.
Even through troubling times today, we still hold on to this hope.
Some of us would like to share what one day means to us.
To me, one day means hope and peace throughout the world. Everything that has happened which is bad, hopefully will never happen again. Right now I feel safe, and I hope that my children will also be safe in the future.
One day means to me that we should remember that we have a goal for world peace and no more wars. One day, everyone will be peaceful and feel like they're part of the worldwide global community.
One day means to me an opportunity to make progress. Every day I work hard to become a better person.
People the same.